I want to now look at another question that has always interested me, which is the origins of modern democracy. Again, we can distinguish between democracy as a formal system, as many people think of it, that is, one man, one vote, one woman, one vote, etc., or a deeper meaning of democracy, which is the ability of people to control their own lives, to be not afraid of the state, to have their own decision making, and to have organizations which allow them freedom, sometimes called civil society, a set of institutions which lie between the state and the individual and which give people individual responsibilities and freedoms. And I want to look at my own explanation or investigation of this in the light of another detective method, and that is the method of looking at small details, apparently insignificant things, and then finding a clue to a very large thing. The question of how democracy emerged, obviously many people trace it back to Greece, and there are signs of it in many civilizations at different times, particularly in the Italian city-states and so on. But the question of how democracy emerged, in my sense of the word, that is, people's rights and freedoms guarded and preserved, is often linked to the rise of democracy in a nation-state, and many people would agree that the longest continuous and perhaps earliest democratic system in the world comes from England. Some date it from Magna Carta in 1215, but many people from the Anglo-Saxons onwards, a form of self-governing rule and independence. So how did this happen? Well, returning to the method of detail, Sherlock Holmes often lectured his sidekick Watson on the importance of looking at small details. Never trust to general impressions, my boy, but concentrate yourself upon details. He tells Watson, "You know my method. It is founded upon the observance of trifles." If he takes up a case, he must examine everything minutely. "If I take it up, I must understand every detail," said he. "Take time to consider. The smallest point may be the most essential." And of course, he shows it in his various of his stories. For example, in The Study in Scarlet, which contains several descriptions of this method. Holmes can quickly identify a man's occupation from external minute signs, quote, "by a man's fingernails, by his coat sleeve, by his boot, by his trouser knees, by the callosities of his forefinger and thumb, by his expression, by his shirt cuffs. By each of these things a man's calling is plainly revealed. That all united should fail to enlighten the incompetent inquirer, in any case, is almost inconceivable." So small details add up to a significant picture. How does this help us with resolving the question of the origins of modern democracy? Well, for many years I was puzzled as to how it happened, and then later in the 1990s I came across the work of a great English legal historian, F.W. Maitland, on the development of trusts. Now this seems a small, insignificant trifle. Trusts, what has this got to do with democracy? Well, let me tell you the story from the small trifle onwards. Maitland pointed out that in the 14th century, lawyers were busy trying to think of a way of getting round what is in effect inheritance tax. All major properties were owned ultimately by the king, and so when someone died, in order to pass it on to their heir, the man had to pay a large sum or give his daughter for the king to get married, and a lot of money went into the crown's exchequer in the form of taxation. So the lawyers said, how can we get round this? And they invented a new legal device called the trust. The trust basically was based on trust. You gave your property away before you died, quite early on, to a group of your friends, maybe 12. And you'd call them together and you say, look, I'm going to give you everything I have, but I trust you, when I die, to give it to my son or daughter or whoever. So we'll make out a document which says you are the owners of my property. And when I die and the king comes along to take his fines and fees and so on, he'll find that I didn't have anything because I'd given it all away to my friends. So this device was invented, and fortunately it was taken under the wing of the most powerful legal official in the country, the Lord Chancellor, who was concerned with these unwritten, trusting kinds of ethical matters. Equity, it was called. So the Lord Chancellor would protect these trusts. They started as a financial device, as a trifle in a way, and gradually grew, and by the time of Henry VIII they were very widespread and very important. So much so that Henry VIII saw that they were undermining the royal finances and brought in an Act of Parliament to abolish them, which they were abolished. But when he died, the lawyers got together and the politicians, and they said, I'm sure Henry didn't really mean that, let's go back to the old system. So they went back to the old system. So the trust idea, a small trifle, developed, expanded, and by the 17th century it was becoming the basis for many things beyond getting around inheritance tax. It had become the basis for economic organizations. If you wanted to set up, as a group of individuals, a trading company like the East India Company, or a big bank or insurance company like Lloyd's, or a stock exchange, these big organizations could be set up by private individuals without the permission of the king. They were held by trustees who were free to do what they liked, and they couldn't be taxed or closed down. They were not charters, they were not corporations, they weren't set up by the royal power, and therefore they were what we would now call non-governmental organizations, NGOs, but much more than NGOs, because the Crown could really do very little about them. They were under charity law, equity, and safeguarded. So the growth, development and power of the British overseas trading and later industrial system was very largely based on this small, trifling trust idea. But as Maitland explains in a number of essays, and all this is summarized in my book on Maitland and Fukuzawa, The Making of the Modern World, as he describes, it expanded into other spheres. For example, the social. People could set up trusts, non-governmental organizations, to do anything they like. If you have a purpose, a name, you can set up an organization which has its own finances, its own club rules. So the great development and famous development of English clubs, societies, associations, organizations, everything from cricket and games clubs to philanthropic societies, Royal Society for this and that, prevention of cruelty to animals or children, the Girl Guides, the Boy Scouts, the Lions, the various kinds of social organisation which have proliferated and gone all over the world. These were based on the idea that you could set up a little group of people who would be the members and run the organisation, and it would be perpetual. It could go on as long as you had people who wanted to do this. So our social life is deeply influenced by the trust. Also our religious life, because England became a Protestant country, but very early on there were all sorts of diverging opinions within Protestantism, and there was also residual Catholics. How were these differing opinions going to be maintained and prevented from being destroyed by the monopoly of the Church, the Anglican Church and the Crown? Well, it was done because they set up these organisations, the Methodists, the Quakers, the Baptists, and so on, as trusts. They had a name, they had a trust number, as the Catholic Church still does in England, amazingly. It's a trust number, whatever. And this meant that they could have their own meeting house or little chapel, they could have their own finances, their own rules, their regulations. They were a body which had an autonomy from the Crown. And so the religious freedoms of the English have been based very much on this. Another area which was very important was the intellectual. Intellectual freedoms are again supported by bodies. You belong to a body who debates, meets, has a library, discusses things. So very important things like the first scientific society in the world, the Royal Society, the British Academy, and then humble things like working men's societies and libraries. All these intellectual and other gathering places were based on the idea of the trust of a group of people who ran it for themselves, free from governmental power. And it seeped into the universities, the schools, which were set up as trusts also. And so the whole educational and intellectual system was deeply influenced by the trust idea. Of course, it influenced politics, English confrontational politics, different parties, freedom of expression. All this revolved to a large extent, particularly early in the democracy after the revolution, in the political clubs, the Whigs clubs, the Tories clubs, the Athenaeum, all these clubs, which are still very important in British politics. These were based on trusts. You have rules, you have members, you have people who could get together and form a formidable group of people to influence policy and politics. Likewise, local government. Local government is very strong in Britain, and you have parish government, you have county government, distributed power in other words, and many of these organisations and localities were based on small groups of people who are acting in effect as trustees. And finally, and often unnoticed, was the effect on what became the greatest empire the world had ever known. The British Empire was set up as a series of trusts. That is to say, when you took over a place, most famously in India but elsewhere, you took it over and set up an organisation to run it, like the East India Company or whatever, which would run it as an independent entity, which was set up in trust. Who was it set up for? Because the whole idea originally of trusts was, of course, that it was set up for someone. It was set up for the people in the place where you went. So if you look at the history of the 20th century and the decolonization and the handing back of the imperial territories to the various people who had been conquered or absorbed by the British Empire, you notice how often the discussion is about, we are now ready to run our own country. Thank you very much. You ran it for us for a while, but we don't need you anymore. Hand it back to us. This was the rhetoric of Gandhi and the Indian nationalists and many others. And there was really no answer to it, because that was basically, as Maitland pointed out, these were held in trust for the people themselves, and it was not possible to argue that they were permanently yours. This was the great difference between the British Empire and the empires of the continent, the French, Spanish and so on, which were part of the metropolitan nation, but in the British case they were separated off as trusts. The importance of the trust idea, the small trifle that had happened from the 14th century and expanded in England, of course was multiplied hugely because it was taken as one of the central features of America. De Tocqueville quite rightly emphasizes the importance of trusts and associations in his great book on democracy in America, and indeed the center of American democracy is civil society and associationalism based on this trust idea. So the whole intermediate protective layer of groups and associations which lie between the very vulnerable individual who can be picked off by the state and the state itself, that middle layer, which is the protection and the basis for modern democracy, and which is developing all over the world, in China, in Africa and elsewhere, is the result of a small trifle which had been overlooked even by Maitland himself to a large extent. He only really appreciated its importance in the last 10 years of his short life. He died at 55 and only really started to write about it when he was about 45. This very, very important trifle is the basis, I think, for much of what we call democracy in the modern world.